Bueno, bienvenidas.
Welcome. My name is Paula Varela. I'm the head of the working class in present-day Argentina, the research seminar of the Sociology department of the University of Buenos Aires. It is a great honor and pleasure, both personal and intellectual, to introduce Susan Ferguson, Associate Professor Emeritus at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. She's a Marxist feminist researcher and activist who has been reading, writing, and thinking about social reproduction theory for many years. As many of you know, Susan has been writing articles on feminist theory, childhood, and capitalism. Last year, she published the book Women and Work, Feminism, Labor, and Social Reproduction, translated into Spanish by Viento Sur and Editorial Silone. Before giving the floor to Susan, I would like to tell you briefly why we organized this activity. First of all, in the seminar and the research team we have in the University of Buenos Aires and CONICET, we have been reading, discussing, and working with the social reproduction theory. The incorporation of this theoretical approach was crucial to understand two phenomena that, although they are closely related, are often studied separately. Which are these two phenomena? First, the enormous undergoing transformations of what Ricardo Antunes calls the class that lives from labor, our historical focus of interest, study, concern, and commitment. And secondly, the emergence of a new feminist wave worldwide, which has, in Argentina, one of its main epicenters. In 2015 and 2016, we asked ourselves, which is the relationship between the emergence of this new feminist wave and the degradation of the living conditions and social reproduction of the working class? In which ways does the tension between what Susan Ferguson calls life-making and death-making in contemporary capitalism affect working women? What bridges can be built between what happens in the workplace and what happens in the households and communities? Social reproduction theory provides a rich set of theoretical tools to think about these questions, and many more, of course. Susan texts, but also Titi Bhattacharya's, Cynthia Rootz's, and others are, at least from our point of view, fundamental to analyze women's movement without skipping class, and to analyze working class without skipping gendering, racialization, sexuality, etc. That is the first reason why we are here, because Susan has a lot to say from the point of view of the social reproduction theory. Second, we've been carrying out fieldwork and publications from this theoretical perspective in the seminar and the research team. Last year, we published a dossier in the journal Archivos de Historia del Movimiento Obrero y la Izquierda called The Work That Women Do, Feminisms, Marxisms, and Social Reproduction, in which we translated into Spanish articles from Bhattacharya, Arrutza, and Susan. In that dossier, we debate with other perspectives that also look at social reproduction, although not in the same way, as that of Silvia Federici. I invite everyone to read the dossier for free and open to access on the journal website. The link to the dossier is in the chat. In March of this year, we published the book Women Workers, A Bridge Between Production and Reproduction, Workplaces and Activism Within the New Feminist Wave. based on extensive fieldwork consisting of surveys and interviews with workers from different places. The book is the first in the series Gender and Labor from the Center for Labor Studies and Research, CEIL, of CONICET, and it is also free and open to access. This year, together with the seminar students present here in the meeting, we will carry out fieldwork consisting of interviews with public health workers in the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires. The goal of our studies is not only to understand and explain the fundamental articulation between class and gender, but also to collaborate with workers' struggles and organization. Therefore, the dialogue with comrades like Susan Ferguson becomes a luxury that we cannot afford to miss. Finally, the third reason we decided to invite Susan, and she was generous enough to accept the invitation, is that COVID-19 pandemic has made more evident and more tragic the contradiction that social reproduction theory illuminates. The contradiction between life-making and profit-making. Health workers summarized that contradiction in a fantastic slogan of struggle. They call us essential, but they treat us as disposable. It is in this contradiction that the pandemic put the focus on. Like the title of this talk and the article that Susan published in Jacobin Lat magazine last year, Life Making or Death Making, Capitalism, Social Reproduction, and Pandemic. With you, Susan Ferguson.
Hello, everybody. And thank you, Paula, for that kind introduction and explanation of all that you're up to. I have to, first of all, just let folks know how thrilled I am to meet Paula in person, sort of in person, as we've been carrying on a discussion over email for at least 2 years, maybe 3, I think. And so it's just exciting to see your face and to interact a little bit more closely. And also, I want to also tell you what an honor it is for me to be invited to present in this seminar and to Buenos Aires group of activists and thinkers and researchers. And I have so much respect for what has been going on in Argentina over the last decade and more, and it's, strikes me as particularly ironic. I sit today in Houston, Texas, which has just passed the most draconian anti-abortion law in the US, and it's very scary, in fact, and there is nowhere near the mobilization needed that you folks in Argentina have shown has been so important to making any real advances in women's health. So anyway, I will go ahead and read my talk because it's lengthy, and I don't, I think it'll go faster if I read. But please signal me if I'm going too fast or whatever, please. Okay, so the pandemic has made one thing crystal clear, that the trade-off between economic health and workers' health, in that trade-off, capitalism sides with the former, which is another way of saying that capitalism sides with death over life. So with this talk, I'm going to draw on the experience of the pandemic, understood through the lens of social reproduction theory, to show how and why promoting the health and well-being of workers in a capitalist society is not and can never be a priority, let alone an end in itself. I argue that there is systemic violence at the heart of capitalism, one that not only persistently thwarts our efforts to live full and meaningful lives and healthy lives, but one that degrades, polices, and regulates the lives of some people more than others, drawing on and reinforcing racist, sexist, queerphobic, colonialist, and other social oppressions in the process. So the pandemic has simply shone a bright light on this fact that it exists within capitalism all the time, providing us with umpteen concrete examples of how state-led social reproduction regimes, or what I sometimes refer to as life-making from above, and those terms will become clearer, I think, as I continue, but how these regimes can only offer ambivalent and uneven support for life, and how they tend as well to intensify the vulnerabilities of the oppressed. The pandemic also provides us with other more uplifting examples, fortunately, of life making from below. And that's a point that I'll conclude the talk with. But first, I want to draw a brief overview of the social reproduction dilemma that's posed by the pandemic, and then flesh out what I mean by insisting that the violence and death making are systemic to capitalism. So in terms of an overview, today is 20 months after the World Health Organization issued its global health emergency, warning us all of the dangers posed by the novel coronavirus. And we sit here in the midst of yet another fatal wave. Yet the world economy is projected to grow by 6%. Stock markets have largely rebounded, and e-commerce is booming, especially actually in Latin America, where it's overtaken the rest of the world. US banks are poised to see, quote, record level earnings, according to the Institute of International Finance. Meanwhile, as we know, 4.7 million people worldwide have died and 226 million people have fallen sick. And those figures are for sure lowballed. In reality, they're much higher. The vast majority of these people, of course, are from the working classes that make the economic growth possible in the first place. And a disproportionate number of those stricken by the virus have been workers whose jobs it is to care for vulnerable people in society. The sick, the dis or differently abled, the young and the old. These are social reproduction workers. So clearly, the capitalist economy has learned to ride out this deadly pandemic. Even if many businesses have gone under, and they have, and even though the rebound is fragile and perhaps being a little bit overstated, the system as a whole did not collapse. And certainly it's rebounding more robustly than it did even after the 2008-2009 crisis, with and today a good many sectors, from healthcare suppliers, online retailers, streaming services, grocery stores, just to name a few, are profiting specifically from the pandemic. So the secret to capitalism's resilience is state spending in the trillions of dollars. And there's two types of state spending. First, there's the quantitative easing, or the direct subsidies that governments have doled out to companies to allow them to ride out the lockdowns. But funneling money to capitalists alone, most ruling classes in most countries bargained, wasn't going to be enough. Capitalism's survival required a second form of state funding, state spending, and that is money to support social reproduction, to support the people and institutions that keep workers alive and healthy. This second form of spending was sanctioned and promoted by the fiscally conservative International Monetary Fund, no less. So in spring 2020, as we know, we saw a dramatic about-face in many state-led regimes, most state-led regimes of social reproduction. After decades of austerity measures, measures that had hollowed out public provision of housing, schools, hospitals, and other crucial life-making supports, we watched with some amazement as in country after country, governments took aggressive steps to support workers' lives. They intervened in markets to produce life-saving equipment. They brought in the army to set up and staff makeshift hospitals. They ordered a moratorium on evictions in some places and even released some prisoners from jail. And many wealthier nations provided direct relief to citizens by extending unemployment benefits and devising new emergency payments. But make no mistake, this remarkable support for life-making efforts of ordinary people was aimed not at preserving life, as one might expect when you're dealing with a fatal, out-of-control virus. No, More accurately, these neo-Keynesian measures were primarily motivated by and aimed at ensuring that businesses have the workers willing and able to risk their own health and that of their families to go to work despite the lockdown. For only then could the economy rebound after coming to an abrupt halt, which it did. And only then could the profits start rolling faster into the ruling class coffers. Of course, the degree to which different countries were able to support workers' lives varied considerably, and this is important. Much depended upon where a country sits in the global imperialist hierarchy of states. Countries with massive debts, whose social spending had for decades been sacrificed to debt payments, faced the pandemic with broken healthcare systems. According to the Jubilee Debt Campaign in 2019, 64 countries, including Argentina and Ecuador, spent more on international debt payments than they spent on healthcare, public healthcare. So for these and other highly indebted countries, the IMF's urgings to expand social welfare meant digging even deeper into debt, debts that would eventually see billions of dollars flow yet again, from poorer nations to wealthy nations, to global lenders, such as the IMF or the World Bank, and to other wealthy nation governments as well, and to private lenders like Goldman Sachs in the US, which no doubt explains, or partly explains, why the US banking sector recorded record earnings last year. And of course, not only have these extraordinary debt levels severely constrained state responses to COVID-19, they've also left poorer countries at the end of the vaccination line. But even the wealthiest countries failed to put the protection of human life ahead of all else. Their COVID relief measures have proven inadequate, temporary, and partial. And we see this clearly in at least the following three ways. First, the tendency of governments around the world to exclude relief from, or to exclude from relief or simply neglect those who are appallingly considered surplus populations. That is people in prisons, residents of long-term care facilities, migrant and undocumented workers, domestic workers, all of whom have, not surprisingly, succumbed more readily to the general more readily than the general population to COVID, and many of whom have also been subject to increased state violence and regulation precisely because they are considered likely spreaders of the virus. So the second way in which we can see the inadequate, temporary, and partial nature of the relief is a tendency of governments to prematurely reopen the economy, putting even greater pressure on so-called essential workers whose workplaces are often unsafe, under-resourced, and understaffed. And again, not surprisingly, this group is also disproportionately represented in COVID cases and deaths. And then thirdly, the temporariness of these measures are seen as many of the income supports and protections that governments had implemented are now starting to wind down. Because the governments have started to worry about resisting, about their own debts and don't want to raise taxes on the rich. So as we are all well aware, the feminized, the racialized, and other oppressed people are overrepresented in both surplus and essential groups, as well as among recipients of emergency welfare and unemployment benefits. These lives, in other words, are deemed particularly expendable, and therefore are more likely to be sacrificed in efforts to keep capitalism afloat. Sadly, all this was to be expected. That is, the fundamental logic of the capitalist system was bound to reassert itself in these ways precisely because capitalist violence and death-making are systemic features of capitalism. They are the outcome of a contradiction at the heart of capitalism, a contradiction between life-making and value-making. And by value-making, I mean the production of capitalist value that happens at waged workplaces that is a source of profit for capital, where people make things that are sold on the market for a profit. So what is that systemic? What do I mean by systemic? And I think this is important just to drive home this point, although many of you may be familiar with it already. So the disastrous management of the pandemic is not fundamentally about a lack of wealth or a lack of resources to stop the virus, nor is it because the wrong and uncaring people lead our governments and our economies, although we could say that about many of them. Although a country's leadership and wealth can make some difference, and there are egregious examples of government complacency and denial from Trump to Modi to Bolsonaro, to name a few, there are actually no discernible patterns in public spending during the pandemic that suggest that less authoritarian governments or those governed by left of center parties spend more on or care more about their citizens' healthcare than authoritarian right-wing regimes. The reason that states can't provide anything more than temporary, partial, and inadequate support for workers' social reproduction has instead to do with the deep internal contradictory logic of a society organized by the imperatives of capitalist production. So to explain that, we call first on Marx, who famously showed how profits are not made by machines or capitalists or by exchanging goods on the market. Rather, capitalist values and profits are made by, they're created, generated by the living human labor power that workers sell to bosses in return for a wage. It is living human labor power because it is inseparable from the lives and bodies of workers. Thus, labor power, and by extension, human life, is an existential condition of capitalism. There can be no value, no profit, no capital, no capitalism without human life. But Marx also observed capitalists do not directly control the daily and generational reproduction of the workers whose labor power they desperately require. There's no Amazon or Ford Motor Company producing human beings. Social reproduction theory builds upon this observation by noting that the vast majority of workers can only access the means of their reproduction, the food, the shelter, clothing, education, healthcare, and so on, in two ways. They can buy those means with the money that they earn through their wages, or they can become clients of state services, such as healthcare and education, housing subsidies, pensions, etc., which are paid for through taxes on wealth. And most people, of course, combined a wage and state support. Yet for capitalists to survive or even to exist, the ruling class must constantly find ways to contain and constrain those wages and to reduce and eliminate taxes. For this is key to their ability to maximize value making and profits and to continue to accumulate wealth. So capitalism is built on this paradox. Profit making requires living labor and therefore the workers who bear it on the one hand, but it also requires that workers be depleted of the very means through which they make life, of direct access to land for subsistence, of wages, and of social services paid for taxes. So, and crucially, because of these capitalist pressures, the work of reproducing life and labor power tends to be unwaged or low-waged. This in turn makes the regulation of paid and unpaid social reproduction workers both logical and necessary to the system's ability to thrive. That regulation, as we've seen, is routinely meted out in violent ways that reinforce existing social oppressions. Thus, we can safely say that in undermining life-making in these ways, capitalism is first and foremost a system of violence, a system of death-making. For capitalism to exist, a worker's life is not, cannot be an end in itself, a thing to be valued, supported, and enriched. For it is not life per se that capitalism requires, rather it is living labor power, which inconveniently, from capital's point of view, is attached to living human beings. Capitalists do not directly manage the paradox that the system engenders. Even if some social reproductive work is commodified, such as when we buy meals at restaurants or pay a private business for our education or our healthcare, most life making is not commodified in that way. It is performed in households and communities, as well as through public sector, state-funded agencies and institutions. And whether it's publicly funded teachers, custodians, nurses, and personal support workers, or the unwaged mother cooking, cleaning, and caring for others at home, or even the unwaged community activist organizing a sit-in to stop deportations, such life-making work is never directly beholden to or immediately organized by a capitalist. There's no business owner who stands to make money from that work, and therefore tries to make that work more productive. But if capital does not directly manage social reproduction, it does have its handmaidens. In every country, the ruling class, in one way or another, regulates and disciplines those who do life-making work. Think of things like school curriculums, citizenship status, housing policies, policing and border control, access to healthcare, laws that define access to healthcare, marriage, and inheritance laws. These are all aspects of a state-led social reproduction regime. And unless there is pushback from below, life-making from above tends to meet two of capital's most pressing needs: the need to reinforce the social divisions and oppressions that contain the costs of social reproduction, and the need to ensure the creation of people who can and will be disciplined workers willing to sell their labor power to capital. So that is, state measures to support life are not simply or primarily about provisioning for the sake of keeping people alive. A central goal, rather, is to prevent people from exercising too much, either individual or collective control over their life-making practices. That goal requires regulating, disciplining, and policing society. Think, for example, of the police brutality that terrorizes racialized, queer, and trans, indigenous people, especially in public spaces, or the role that church and medical authorities have played in regulating women's bodies and enforcing cis hetero-patriarchal households. These are just two examples of state-sanctioned violence and discipline that have contained and demeaned the social reproduction of certain oppressed populations for centuries. So this is what I mean when I talk about systemic violence of capitalism. The contradiction between life-making and value-making is embedded in the very logic of capitalist accumulation, and state management of that contradiction tends to produce and perpetuate violence against all bodies, but especially against those who are already members of socially excluded and oppressed groups. That's why the pandemic relief measures that governments have introduced in the last year and a half are and will inevitably be inadequate, temporary, and partial. That's why these measures tend to reinforce rather than alleviate existing inequalities and oppressions. So no matter what measures governments take to support life-making, they cannot overcome this paradox. And the only way to overcome the paradox is to overcome capitalism. And so the question then becomes, how do we do that? And I cannot, if I knew the full answer to that, we wouldn't be sitting here. but I can give you some ideas that I have anyway. Fortunately, the pandemic has also shone a bright light on how crucial spaces and practices of social reproduction from below can be to building widespread resistance against oppression, capitalism and oppression. First, these past 20 months, the life-making work of ordinary people ordinary working people has significantly compensated for the state's and capital's negligence. Millions of people are attempting to fill the gaps by organizing mutual aid networks to provide services such as childcare, grocery and prepared meal delivery, ambulance rides, just to name a few. There's been an explosion, in other words, of alternative forms of social reproductive labor from below, ordinary people looking beyond private households to assess community needs and to develop practical cooperative ways of meeting them. As well, some are seeing the pandemic as a time to enrich life-making where possible, to unleashing their creativity and ingenuity through music, laughter, games, drama, and more, much of it online. And that's, I pause there for a second because you think about, we tend to worry so much about the bare necessities, but don't we want to live in a society where life is more than just meeting the bare necessities? And I think that's really important, that the pandemic has kind of made that clear to us that we lack that often. But more than substitute for the gaps in social reproductive resources and work, life making from below can push, and often has pushed back, against the powers that have created these gaps in the first place, taking on the bosses and the local officials in a more confrontational manner. Prisoners have rioted for safer living quarters, supported by car caravans on the outside. Housing activists have launched incredible rent strikes and occupied buildings. Teachers and parents have protested unsafe school reopenings, and paid social reproductive workers, from bus drivers to nurses to bin collectors around the world, have walked off their jobs to demand hazard pay and protest unsafe practices, not just for themselves, but crucially for the people that they serve as well. Most explosively, the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, sparked by yet another US police shooting, George Floyd, on May 25th in Minneapolis, pushed back against one of the most powerful forces of coercive social reproduction from above, especially for people of color, the police. And in the process, BLM's call to defund the police and to channel those funds toward essential life-making institutions and practices in our communities showed us how powerful the struggle over the conditions of our social reproduction can be, how powerful and how inspiring. That call was answered by a multiracial uprising of 26 million people in the US alone, and more beyond its borders. People inspired by visions of collective democratic control over the conditions of social reproduction, summed up really nicely, I think, by Critical Resistance, which is an abolitionist, an important abolitionist organization in the US, a statement that they wrote in 2009. I'm quoting from the statement here. What if we got together with members of our communities and created systems of support for each other? We are capable of looking after and caring for one another, providing each other with our basic human needs, creating community self-determination. Relying on and deploying policing denies our ability to do this, to create real safety in our communities. So the remarkable support for this radical anti-racist movement has to be seen as a consequence, to a considerable degree, of the pandemic, of that bright light that it shone on the relentlessness with which capitalism banks on and intensifies racism, sexism, and other social oppressions to prioritize value making over life making. It's not simply that people woke up to this. At many levels, ordinary folks know that their lives are a struggle, even outside of a pandemic, and they know that the economy takes precedence. The difference today is that the pandemic created conditions in which more and more people felt compelled to self-organize. Not only did they come together to help each other, they often did so in ways that directly challenged the powers of capital and its state to organize life-making from above. This is crucial if we're serious about overturning capitalism. Sadly, at least in the United States, the movement has been demobilized, the BLM movement, in large part, I think, thanks to the channeling of political energies and resources into an election between two parties of the ruling class. And we can talk more about that, obviously, in the discussion. What the left needs to remember, though, is that what we've learned from BLM and other pandemic fightbacks, that communities struggle to live, literally to not be shot, but also to better resource their life making, can resonate so powerfully throughout the working class. The point is worth dwelling on for a moment. Struggles to better resource and develop greater democratic control over our spaces and practices of social reproduction have a unique potential to spread outward. That's because the work of life making is all about meeting human needs, meeting community needs, needs that are systematically denied by the capitalist organization of work. The left also needs to remember that life making from below can never fully compensate for the gaps in state-led social reproduction, no matter how many mutual aid or cooperative societies we create. So long as capitalism and the capitalist state survive, our survival will be compromised. That's why it's so important for the struggles around life making to confront capitalist power through strikes and demonstrations that reach into and across all spaces of capitalist production and reproduction, in communities, on the streets, and even in for-profit businesses. After all, waged workers producing value for capital do not leave their lives behind when they go to work. In recent times, we've seen some hopeful examples of how a social reproductive consciousness has informed workplace actions. Think of Amazon Employees for Climate Justice's Sick Out that they organized, that was to draw attention to that company's COVID policies, or the and to the Amazon's racism and environmental irresponsibility. Or think of Google's walkout for real change against sexual harassment. Or think of the dock workers shutting down 29 US ports in support of BLM, to name a few. The point is that social reproduction struggles can and do take place inside capital's doors as well as outside. And it's only by connecting these that the solidarities across social divisions and hence the power required to end capitalism can be fostered. That's me. I look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts and comments.
Thank you very much, Susan, for this very enriching presentation. There will be a lot of questions for sure. The dynamics for collective exchange will be as follows. We will have 3 rounds of 4 questions each, which Susan will answer in interventions of 10 to 15 minutes maximum, because at 1 p.m. we have to finish the session.
Hacer trabajo de campo la semana que viene, y la segunda y la tercera ronda está abierta a las preguntas del público. Una cosa importante es que las preguntas deben realizarse por el chat de la forma más clara y más precisa que puedan formularla, para que sean leídas y traducidas a Susan para que ella las pueda responder. Juliana, Josefina, si querés comenzar con la primera ronda de preguntas.
Hola, buenos días. Comienzo con las primeras preguntas. La primera pregunta dice: en su texto, usted afirma que hay una contradicción insoluble en el corazón del sistema. El capital debe transformar la fuerza de trabajo en una fuente de plusvalor y al mismo tiempo debe socavar su producción. En este sentido, podría pensarse que hacer vivir significa, bajo el capitalismo, hacer vivir la mercancía de fuerza de trabajo. ¿Qué implicancias tiene definirlo de ese modo? ¿Qué contradicciones implica dicho proceso? La segunda pregunta es: Marx hablaba del trabajo como fin y el trabajo como medio. Podría decirse que el trabajo de reproducción social que se lleva a cabo en el hogar, por ejemplo, en el cuidado y crianza de niños, tiene aspectos del trabajo como fin. Pero a su vez, el hecho de que la reproducción social implique la reproducción de la mercancía, fuerza de trabajo, para que sea explotada por el capital, implica también un aspecto del trabajo como medio. Según su punto de vista, ¿hay alienación en el trabajo de reproducción social? La tercera pregunta es: con la aparición del COVID-19 se volvió evidente cuán necesarias son algunas actividades para la reproducción de la vida, y también quedó demostrado cuán importante es para el sistema capitalista no detener el sistema de valorización y reproducción del capital. En ese sentido, muchos trabajadores estuvieron y están en la primera línea exponiendo su propia vida en pos de asegurar la continuidad de la reproducción de la fuerza de trabajo. Por ejemplo, las enfermeras de los hospitales públicos. Y muchos otros están en la primera línea en pos de asegurar la continuidad de la acumulación capitalista. Por ejemplo, los trabajadores de logística. Sin embargo, ¿qué pasa con aquellos trabajadores que no son esenciales ni para la reproducción social ni para la producción de valor? ¿cómo puede pensarse el problema de la fuerza de trabajo que no tiene chances de realizarse como mercancía desde el marco teórico de la teoría de la reproducción social? Y la última pregunta para este bloque es, en su artículo publicado en la revista Jacobin, usted afirma que los estados capitalistas se ven obligados a degradar y drenar los recursos necesarios para reproducir la vida humana y para hacerlo se sirven del racismo, el sexismo, el colonialismo, etc. ¿Podría profundizar en esta idea? ¿Cómo es la relación entre racismo, sexismo, colonialismo y degradación de los recursos para la reproducción social? Gracias.
Which is the relationship between racism, sexism, colonialism, and social reproduction resource degradation?
Should I answer those at this point? Okay. Okay, thank you. Those are fabulous. And I also want to make sure that I properly thank my translators, make sure Tomas and Fernanda, I totally appreciate your ability to facilitate this discussion. It is essential. So, okay, these are big questions and I will probably only partially answer them, but let me start. So the first one, I think is about, now I hope I'm remembering this correctly, the insolvable contradiction between
you can repeat if you want, Susan.
Okay, tell me if I'm correct that it's about understanding social reproductive work as actually producing a commodity labor power. Is that right? Okay, so yes, social reproduction work does actually produce the commodity labor power. And, but it is not reproduced capitalistically in the same way that if a worker who goes into, you know, a factory or a for-profit, let's say, so a car factory, for instance, is producing a car that will be sold on the market. It's that worker, their production process is governed by the fact that they must produce that car as cheaply as possible so that the value of the car realized on the market can be maximized. And that for that to happen, that worker feels the pressure directly from their boss, and their work is organized in multiple ways by the fact that their boss knows exactly how cheaply they have to or how productive that worker has to be. So the whole organization of labor for that worker is determined by what is called the capitalist law of value, the way in which value determines what production actually survives in capitalism, what company will survive as profitable in capitalism. Somebody working both unwaged at home or even in a public sector hospital, and there's different, or a public sector organization, there's different ways in which their work processes are organized, but neither of those cases will you have the same pressure, the same direct and almost, you know, scientific, I guess, calculation of how much to produce, where to produce, when to produce, with what resources to produce. And so that's one really important difference between you're producing a labor power as a commodity for sure, but, or at least you're always producing it as a potential commodity, and I'll come back to that in a second, for sure. But you're not organized by capital directly and immediately in the same way that if you're working for profit. In public sector organizations, you are a little more organized by capital, but not directly, and not ever directly, because there is no capitalistic boss. There's pressures that are exerted because states are under pressure to keep taxes down, et cetera. But there's no calculus of what is the most productive way to make a patient well. What is the most productive way to make a student learn? Those are things that are not quantifiable in the same way that there is a productive way of knowing, or there's a calculated way of knowing how much, or how to organize the production of making a car or packaging food or whatever it is that is for profit. So yes, if you're working in the public sector, you, as a social reproductive worker, you have some pressures that you definitely will feel, and there's some discussion about those. I think I draw on somebody in the book who refers to them as kind of proxy measures of capitalistic value, but they're not actual capitalistic value measures. And that's important because it also means that people who work in those situations have some degree, or can have, not necessarily, but can have some degree of flexibility with how they organize their work. So if, for instance, your patient that is normally really cooperative all of a sudden has a horrible day and it takes you twice as long to dress them or whatever you're doing, to try and get an IV into them or whatever, then you take that time and you have to take that time. And so that's actually contradicts, or it doesn't matter, I guess, at some level, whether or not your bosses want you to take that time. You have to take that time to get the work done. So that's one thing. And part of the reason that social reproductive labor has to be flexible in its time is because the people that are being produced, because the first thing that's being produced is not labor power, it's people, right? So labor power is something that people hold within them as a capacity. They bear it, they bring it to market and sell it to the capitalists, but they are not simply labor power. They are full embodied people with all sorts of different potentials. And so the fact that a social reproduction is all about creating people, and people's needs are varied and unpredictable sometimes, and all that, then means that social reproductive labor has built into it a certain flexibility, has to have, if it's going to be successful in producing life. So we also know that flexibility means that it can be really, really degraded and people can forego meeting their needs, right, in ways that don't happen. Like a car does not forego meeting its needs when it's being produced. So it's a totally different type of production in my mind. So the other thing I'll just say really briefly on that is that, so yes, you're making labor power as a commodity, but you're making labor power also as a means of expression. People don't have to sell their labor power, and people's labor power may never be realized on the market. It may never become a commodity. So I may produce a child who never works for capital, and therefore, but it doesn't mean that I'm not doing social reproductive labor. So I think, that point is that there's a real difference in producing what a person, both in terms of how it is organized, but also in terms of what you're producing. What you are producing, first and foremost, is the person, not the labor power. And the labor power is something that they have within them, that yes, you are also producing that when you are producing them, but it's not, your goal is not, I'm producing a labor power in order to sell, so that they can sell themselves on the market. Although that is in your mind, certainly parents will know, oh my God, will my child be, a productive young person or whatever, able to live on their own and become independent or whatever. So it's complicated. It's both, but it's not just labor power. So I hope that helps a little bit clarify. Marx, and this is sort of related perhaps, Marx, labor power is an ends and a means. Absolutely. I think social reproductive labor does both. And that is exactly, I think, what I was sort of that, what I was trying to explain there is that you are producing both a whole person as an end in themselves, but you are also producing it as a potential means of making money, of labor power for sale. And it's that conflict that people feel so, I think, so acutely, particularly, I'm thinking about parents, but people reproduce themselves this way too, that, how much time can I go to that party and spend all night if I have to go to work? Like I want to have the pleasure and the fun. I want to, my life is worth doing that, yet I'm going to be so tired for work tomorrow or whatever. So you're producing there the very idea that my actions, my activities are, complicated in terms of them being both an end and a means. So I think the answer to that question is yes, social reproductive labor produces both. And is there alienation in social reproduction labor? So yeah, I mean, I think so in the sense of it's not the same sort of, again, it's not the same alienation in that abstract labor is being extracted from your concrete labor so that it can be sold for a commodity, wrapped up in a commodity and sold on the market. But it is alienation in the sense that you don't have full control over your labor process. And you don't have full control over your labor process in the first place because you do not own the means of your own social reproduction. So you just simply you can't exercise that collective or individual control. But it's also because you do feel the pressures of a capitalist time discipline. You organize your social reproductive day, if you are a worker, around going to work, your meals, your timing for your meals, or going to school if you're a student. So there's, that's a way of you not defining, or the collective community that you're in doesn't define all the conditions of your social reproduction. But in fact, this sort of broad-reaching capitalist organization of work and life does define it. And if you call that alienation and put pressure on it that you have to do it cheaply because you only have so much of a wage as well, or you only get so much in taxes. So yes, I think those things are forms of alienation. They're distinct from the type of alienation of value production, but they are related but distinct. COVID-19. Workers risk their own lives reproducing the labor force, both nurses, logistic workers. But what about the non-essential workers, right? The surplus, what I was referring to as surplus populations, are they a commodity? So I would say about, this, I assume you mean here people who are unemployed and people who are in nursing homes, perhaps, and people who are perhaps in prisons or detention centers. So, I mean, I think it varies a degree to which they are potential commodities. Some of them are potential, their labor power is potential to be sold. I think, migrants very much who are stuffed into detention centers or under bridges currently right now in between the US and Mexico. They are surplus at the moment, but they are also potentially in the future labor powered to be sold, or they carry the labor power that is a potential to be sold. People in nursing homes, of course, have expanded, generally will not be workers again in the future, and they are surplus to capital, absolutely. And so no, I don't think they are. I think when you're reproducing them, you're not really reproducing a commodity, but you are within, I guess it's interesting because it is maybe something that social reproduction theory has to kind of grapple with a little bit better than we have so far, but you are reproducing human life, which has at some level been socially, we've decided as a society, even though we're a capitalist society, to not simply let people die. Although some people we do let die, but there's some people that we don't, and we look after them in their old age. And so that, I think, I can't say too much more about that, but I do think that's an interesting area to kind of continue to develop and think through. I think that I think I'll leave it at that, because then I think if other people have ideas around that, I'd be interested to hear too, because I would certainly agree that you're not reproducing a labor power, you're reproducing a past labor power. But that's irrelevant, I guess. But the pressure, the fact that they are I guess the only thing I'd add is that the fact that they are surplus to capital means that those pressures to keep the costs of their reproduction down are even higher, because they are not considered potential labor power. So that's number 3. Number 4 was capitalist state obliged. Okay, so say more about the relationship between racism, sexism, the way the state integrates and uses that. So I'm thinking here, I'll just, again, briefly, because I've gone on a little bit too long, say that the, a really good example, I think, is through immigration policies, where states can bank on a social racism, like a society acceptable level of racism, to decide that certain people from certain countries are and certain places are okay to let into their borders, but other people are not, and often on the basis of it's in the North, it's often on the basis of the racist ideas about people with darker skin colors, there's, I think that's a really, states sort of say, okay, governments will say this population will accept immigration controls for that reason, against, take the obvious one in the US right now, against the Haitians at the Mexican border, and so they will use that. They will use, and therefore they reinforce the racism by merely drawing on those tropes. Even if they don't do them directly, they do it in the very fact that you're not letting in certain populations plays into already existing racist attitudes, et cetera. So I think and I guess the point is, in some ways, we can't expect governments to really seriously tackle racism and sexism and queer phobia and transphobia, not in a really significant structural way where they open up the borders to everybody, or they create all kinds of resources for women who are experiencing violence and trans people who are experiencing violence. We can't expect them to counter that because it is expensive to do that, because those measures will make people feel like they have more control over their own lives, and that will ultimately be expensive and not healthy for capitalism. And so it's in some ways, there are of course states that will be outrightly racist or outrightly sexist, but more likely today they are going to draw on and use those divisions that are already in society, and they are not going to work to undermine those divisions in society in any real significant way, beyond some really kind of fairly weak notions of diversity. Or so that might be a little bit complicated or not as clear as I want it to be, but I'll leave it at that for now and see if there are other questions. Thanks.
Well, this is the second round of questions, Susan. So, first one, we witnessed how during the pandemic, the racial problem became central in the United States after a policeman killed George Floyd. In Europe, racism appears in the form of hate towards African migrants and Muslims. According to your point of view, how did COVID-19 affect those groups discriminated before the pandemic? The second one is, you mentioned different ways of organizing social reproduction from below and ways of collective organizing to defend life, as in the impressive Black Lives Matter movement or the different social reproduction salaried workers' struggles. This year in Argentina Argentina has had important struggles from the health sector, the most important of which took place in the southern region, in Neuquén province, where the workers were able to close off the petrol route, generating millionaire losses for the gasoline companies. These struggles from below generally develop without the support or even against the union's leadership. Since they don't usually have a stable organization, those impressive and valuable offsprings are not able to continue over time and finally evaporate or are diverted through elections into ruling class parties. How can this problem be solved? Third question, in relation to these struggles, how are they related apart from the fact that they take place simultaneously? Are there ways in which SRT can guide our strategy when we consider forging solidarities between these struggles? And then I have another one that I have to translate it now. So in relation to what you stated, related to life making from below. Give me 1 second, Susan, that I am. You mentioned the case of families that widen their horizons apart from private households, creating collective strategies from the community to guarantee the reproduction of life in a different way than what state institutions do. Relating the life reproduction as a way of well, I'm struggling with this question. It says, sorry, I will repeat, Susan. The fourth question says, which type of strategies can we think in the future related to these collective spaces from below, communal and from below, that strengthen the social bonds and solidarities in looking forward the reproduction of life. So I don't know if the last question was clear, Susan, because I am translating it in this moment. Let me know if you want me to repeat it or make it more clear.
I think I have it. Thanks, Thomas. So, okay, a couple of those are kind of similar questions in some ways. The first question was about how did COVID affect the groups who have been the recipients of terrible racism prior to the pandemic. And I'm not 100% sure what's being asked here, except that, you know, of course, those groups were, you know, much more vulnerable to the disease, and because already capitalism as a racist society had, you know, been, and as a society which had for years been, as I said in the talk, defunding lots of life supporting systems, and had been, already those groups were already vulnerable, and their vulnerability simply increased when you have a virus that is an, you know, equalizer in some ways, because even Donald Trump and Bolsonaro can, and, you know, many of the world's leaders can get COVID, everybody can get sick, but it makes a big difference whether the person getting sick has already been on, you know, the more privileged end of the social reproductive spectrum or not. And so those groups have been already undermined, their health and well-being had already been undermined. So I think definitely the pandemic affected those groups more in terms of more deaths and more, and the stats are out there, more deaths and more sicknesses. But it's also the case that the lockdowns that occurred during the pandemics were experienced more harshly often by people in those groups, both because many of them lived in more crowded housing. Many of them, if you talk about Palestinians, for instance, who live in many of whom still live in refugee camps, and those within Israel were denied, you know, the healthcare because of the situation there, because of the oppression there that they face. So there's you know, those kind of those you know, the lockdown was felt harder in terms of how they existed at home. They were also, because they weren't recipients often of, as migrants or immigrants often even, they weren't always recipients of the benefits. So they were often forced to go to work when other people could receive benefits and stay home, some other people. So there's all sorts of ways in which the pandemic intensified their the degradation of their social reproductive life, their ability to social reproduce themselves. And so that I think, you know, that struggle for them to exist also you know, would have made, or, you know, I don't know, I mean, I guess they were also becoming more conscious, I think, of the costs of their racism, of the racism against them. And so that is, I think, part of what fueled the Black Lives Matter movement, because people were saying, wow, it's really, look at how clear it is that that this is a racist society. And cop shootings is one example of it, but it's not the BLM, or the Black-led protest was not simply about the cop shooting, although that was what inspired it. It was really very much about the conditions of life in America. And I think that kind of saying it openly, coming out in the thousands and showing the anger around those conditions did inspire a lot of other groups to do the same throughout Europe and the US and the Americas. I don't know if that fully answers that question. So I apologize if I didn't get it right. Social reproduction collected from below, the healthcare sector in Argentina. That's amazing to hear about the healthcare workers in the South. And yeah, the idea that there is no union leadership is a fairly common one, or here too, a common complaint here. The union leadership is always behind the 8 ball on these. At any social upheaval, it's because the leadership exists to make a deal with capital. The leadership's, whole raison d'etre is to try and come to some sort of agreement with the bosses to continue production. And so people who, so that's a conservatizing role to play. And however much unions can get on board with certain aspects, and you saw with I don't know how many people followed the unionization drive in Alabama at Amazon, which really tried to take an anti-racist kind of approach to saying, here are racialized people who are being underpaid and highly regulated and disciplined. It still didn't do it with as much gusto, I'd say, and with as much commitment to simply defying capital as one needed to have to work in the end. So I don't, the union leadership is a problem, and I think anytime in COVID or not, when there is real social change, it always comes from below that level. You can't expect the unions to take charge. It has to be self-organized. And I think, and you can work with unions to a point, obviously, and unions are important. I'm not trying to say they're not, but they're not going to solve the problems for us. And so I think the self-organization from below, from the rank and file workers, is so much more important and so much what needs to be supported. And it's precisely why, to get on to the last 2 questions, it's precisely why we actually need, to start to develop networks, organizations that are more than just community-based, but have a broader reach across cities, across countries, internationally, so that you can coordinate and articulate those kind of demands and solidarities in a more comprehensive way. And it's, when we talk about the left in society, and I can talk more about North America, obviously, but you have your parliamentary left, and then there's sort of the rest of us out here who are more radical left, with lots of divisions between us over here and not terribly well organized. But this radical left has got to find ways of coordinating and developing and articulating a vision and and develop the institutions and the infrastructure that different communities and fightbacks in different places can kind of link into. And that's a huge job. BLM did it to a certain extent, I think, but not, I wouldn't say BLM's a great model of it. You might look further back in US history to something like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee or something that they, where they did a whole bunch of work about, protecting Black lives in all kinds of different spaces in the US, but they were a national body that coordinated that. And I think that's the sort of thing that we want. We don't, traditionally in the past, things like the Communist Party or some of the bigger left parties have wanted to play that role, and maybe something like that could happen again. I don't know that that's necessarily the best way forward, but I do think what needs to happen has to happen organically. And that you've got to be a little bit dangerous if you think you know the answer. Like, you have to be cautious and humble and not say, you know, exactly what that form is going to look like in the future, I think. So that's what I would say about that. So I think the, sorry, I had a thought just pass through my mind. So, right, and so I think that's a sort of organization, just to skip to the fourth question for a second, I'll come back to the third one in a second, but the fourth question is, you know, what strategies do you have to strengthen and boost solidarities from below? I think that's the sort of thing that's needed for that, something that can articulate that vision, that can start to create institutions and practices around coordinating those spaces. And yeah, so I think I'd say that. And then just in terms of the third question, which is sort of also related to the fourth question, I think, is the how, you know, what does it mean on the ground to create and develop the solidarity between these different spaces? I think it means something like things as simple as, you know, if you're a healthcare worker and you're trying to get resources for your hospital, for your job, that you are outreaching to the community members who are going to be affected by that and are going to benefit from that, and that those community members are also people who are workers in different places, and that they would take, you know, you would request they would take those demands and questions into their workplaces and maybe organize something in a workplace that you could jointly combine with a healthcare worker demo. I think that's, you know, kind of one sort of example. I think that if you're talking about, you know, and I guess, sorry, I can't remember which question asked this, but to talk more about, you know, those mutual aid and cooperative societies who have been doing such great work, helping each other out and everything. I think part of what needs to happen is not there. I mean, those people, you think of people who, for instance, do hurricane relief work or whatever in New Orleans or whatever, those people are pretty busy and working very hard towards those ends. I think what you need is the left to go in and or people from the left or people from broader organizations, Black Lives Matter, it doesn't have to be the organized socialist left, but to go in and actually help them and then draw them into those struggles, draw into the struggles together. So I think it's not a matter of people who are working in cooperatives having to necessarily do that hard work. I think it's actually the left that needs to learn how to relate to those spaces better. And and then hopefully inspire people to try to develop, as I say, those broader networks. And so I guess I'll leave it at that. I sometimes feel like I'm going off topic, or maybe not fully answering, but there we go.
Okay, Susan, so final round of questions. It says, I'm a social worker and our social interventions are basically with people that probably will never be integrated in the salaried labor. Therefore, we ask ourselves about our role in relation to life reproduction strategies from outside the market as an alternative. What can you tell us to think our professional role in these processes? How can we accompany the resistance process from our distance from production spaces? Second question, from your perspective, where does the working class revolutionary power come from? Third question, from your perspective, is there a contradiction between the search for profit from the individual capitalists and the total capital as a subject of the organization of life in this historical moment? Finally, the concept of patriarchy has been circulating a lot in the new feminist wave. How would you define patriarchy? How it is related to the SRT? And that's it, Susan.
Wow, again, these are wonderful questions, and I am humbled by them. So thank you all for these questions. And I hope I can do them some service, if not full service. So the first question, social worker, their role that produces life outside of the market. How do you, I think the question is around how do you participate in trying in those struggles that are happening even at a distance from production, if I understood that correctly. So I guess, I mean, I think, you know, people who are social workers, I mean, there's two ways, I guess, two things I can think of. One is, as a worker yourself, do you have the resources and the fundings, et cetera, that you need to truly support the people you're trying to support, regardless of the fact that they're not going to be, you know, tomorrow's workers in factories or whatever, that regardless of the fact that you're not working with people who you're reproducing their labor power for, but you are reproducing life, right? And the question is, as always, do you know, how can you as a social worker work with your other colleagues to pressure your employer for more resources? So I think that's a question. You may not be unionized. It may be very difficult. It may be, and you know, I think, and these things are difficult. And so I would say that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is to also, I would say, I imagine that, well, I mean, I have no idea what your particular job is, but in terms of the types of folks you could be working with, if they are racialized, if they are disabled, or if they are feminized, these are areas in which I think, you know, trying to support and draw in struggles that are not, you know, workplace-based struggles, but actually community struggles around those issues may be helpful, may be supportive, or would be, I think, helpful and supportive to your work. And I think social workers, you know, have, yeah, I mean, you've already have a fairly stressful job, I'm sure. I think that, you know, that requires sort of over and above outside of work commitments as well. And so you know, getting folks involved, again, it's a little bit hard not knowing precisely what community you're working with, but I'm just thinking even of, you know, there's a rich history of disabled people fighting back against the system too. And you know, doing anything that can encourage the organization of your clients to fight for resources is also really important. And I would say a good way to start thinking about participating in. And, you know, once that gets going, then there is a question of, you know, trying to gain support for that from people who are in the feminist movement, in the anti-racist movement, whatever. So I guess that's sort of, I'll leave that question there. Where does working class revolutionary power come from? I think it comes from our bodies. I think it comes from our minds. I think it comes from the fact that we are living human beings and not just labor power. I think that's absolutely crucial. I think it comes from the fact that yeah, that we cannot be, our lives cannot be fully subsumed, as one would say, to capitalist power, that we do have a life force outside of capitalism. We do not simply respond to capitalism. So I think working class power in the first instance comes from that, but it's not a class power if it's just individually exercised. It's a class power when it's collectively organized and developed. And that is something that happens in different ways. I think that happens through political meetings where people talk and think and whatever. I think it happens though also through actually just somebody going out on the street and joining a demonstration can be part and parcel of experiencing something different. Like when you think about even a demonstration, which often demonstrations, certainly in the US, less so perhaps in Argentina, where you've had more success in some ways, but recently, but in the US, often demonstrations feel like a bit of a duty, and you just go out there and you're a body amongst a bunch of things. But when you think about it, you are actually really overturning a lot of the day-to-day reality when you're out walking on the streets with a bunch of folks that you don't know, and you are experiencing your body and your mind doing things and chanting or whatever, doing things that you wouldn't normally do, and that in fact push, at least symbolically, if no other way, against expectations. And I think for some people, even that, for some people that can be life-changing. And I think, so I think starting there, I think it starts in those kind of places. And I think it starts when people organize to take control over their situation, whether it be at work or be in the a community, or so I think it starts with a collective acknowledgement, recognition of the fact that we can live our lives outside of capital. I think that's where it starts. It obviously needs a lot more, and it definitely means, for real revolutionary power to be constantly, I think, confronting and pushing against the way in which work is organized now. And so therefore pushing against capital and the capitalist state. So let's see, contradiction between, so I think this third question is about, I'm not sure I've got the full understanding of this third question. So maybe Thomas, you can tell me again. I think it's asking me about whether an individual capitalist maybe has a different relationship to social reproduction than when you're talking about capital as a whole, as capital as a system. Is that what the question is?
Yes, in the question, the social reproduction is not mentioned.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think that, thank you. Sorry. So yes, yes. Individual capitalists are, much more short range vision, and there is no capital subject as a whole that has a coherent interest. Capital, as we know, is a pretty anarchic system, and there's long-term planning is something that is not, as we see with the climate issues that we have today, the devastation of the climate, of ecology today. There's no voice, or there's no coherent kind of conscious, coherent subject to capital as a whole. And so yeah, much of this stuff, much of what I'm talking about is simply a logic of a system and that works out over time. And of course, it means that individual spaces of whatever can push against that logic, can defy that logic. So you might have a capitalist who actually, and you do have capitalists, I think, who actually do not do the most to maximize their profits in their end, et cetera. But it's also true that anyone who really defies the logic of needing to create the most productive workforce possible is not going to last as an individual capitalist. So somebody who constantly undermines that. So yeah, there's a difference between them. I think that's, I don't know quite what more to say about that. So maybe I'll just leave it there. So sorry if I didn't answer that terribly well. Going on to the patriarchy question. So, for a long time as a Marxist feminist, I had a real trouble accepting the term patriarchy because I came up as a Marxist feminist in the 80s and 90s, and patriarchy to me at that point meant that men, by virtue of being men, ruled women, and that that was what it meant, and that they had power over women, that they controlled women. And I could not accept it because I could not see that as being universally true. And I did not understand where men would get this power from, precisely if it wasn't biological. So I had those kind of associations with the term patriarchy. I've shifted over my years, and I've understood that there can be more subtle understandings of the term patriarchy. And I think they actually are more subtle today, the way, or the more complex is a better word. So yeah, I think of patriarchy now as simply a way of describing a sexist system that works to privilege men, some men more than other men, works to that, again, like capitalism, there's no subject doing it, but that within the, it's like somebody has set the table, because of capitalism, really set the table in a particular way where on the whole, the power, the kind of privileges, the powers, the benefits of the system are going to be more weighted towards men than towards women. And that can work at different levels. It can work on an economic level. Men make more than women at work, they get paid more, or at a personal level, men feel entitled to women's bodies. Again, not all men, not all women. And that's because it's not actually a biological power that men have over women. It's actually a social power. It's one that we created socially, that the way in which we've organized society, that has meant regulating women's bodies, that is, and ensuring that they are, that, we have a group of people who will do social reproductive work for no or little wages, and that it's often women, that those sorts of things play into and continually reproduce patriarchy. I think I'll leave it at that. Okay. But thank you all so much. This is really interesting, and I really hope I did do some questions some justice, and I've totally enjoyed myself. I hope you have a great time in this rest of the seminar. It sounds like a fascinating and excellent seminar. So, and really important work that you're doing. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Susan, I think we've got one more. So the question is, Paula is asking if you are willing to answer the question. Yeah. The question is, What do you understand for overcoming the capitalist social organization? What would imply that life social reproduction is not alienated from capital?
Okay, so thanks. And yeah, I'd have no problem answering your question. So what would it look like to have life, a non-alienated life making? Is that fair enough? So, okay. So again, I think that's something that has to be, you know, I can imagine things, but it might be different things to different people. But I think that you would look toward communal, collective experiments that are happening today to start to model some of these things. I could see, but again, it may not be correct, but like it may not be everybody's vision, but I could see, you know, community kitchens and socialized child rearing. It could be, you know, to certain degrees, to some degree, to full degree, it would be, you know, all this, I think the key thing is that the communities themselves would organize it and not me. So I not, you know, so it would be, things would be decided and allocated according to, you know, democratic, gatherings of people who would, you know, decide where to put their resources and how to do that. So I think what makes it non-alienated is the fact that you'd have to overcome capitalism for that, because capital as a whole would never tolerate that on a wide scale. Capitalism will not tolerate on a wide scale total socialization of childcare, for instance. It won't pay for it. It won't accept that you know, the structural changes that would need to happen for that. So assuming we're in a post-capitalist society, I think then in some ways you'd be looking at, you know, models from cooperative movements today that would be helpful. You'd be looking at models of worker organization in factories might be helpful too, because those are models of people actually taking control of the conditions of production. So you could also, you know, understand and try to think through models of people taking control of the conditions of their reproduction. And, you know, all done with a mind to, I would think that you would, as a community, would probably want to prioritize saving the planet. So, and seeing the planet as part of what you are, you know, a resource for your reproduction, and therefore highly valuable because it reproduces life. I'm sure there would be arguments. I'm sure there would be fights. I'm sure there'd be times when the tensions would not work out in the way people always want. But it would be a living project that would hopefully, if it could be, democratically, you know, adjustable in terms of, you know, whoever is making the decisions are, you know, recallable people who, you know, however it is done. So I just say it's not really, there's not really a blueprint, I guess, for how that would look, but it would look very different from what it looks like today, I would say. And it doesn't mean also, I guess the only other thing I'd say is it doesn't mean necessarily that private life would disappear. I don't think that either. I actually think likely there'd be some greater sociality of life, but in terms of getting things done that need to get done, but that, you know, it's quite possible that people could combine that with certain forms of private life too. That's my thought. So thank you again.
I would like to thank you for your invitation, Susan. It's very important for us because everything you've commented on your talk is part of the discussions we've been holding, and for us, these exchanges are very productive. These intellectual exchanges we've been having. I think that for all of us present here, this has been the case. So thank you so much again for accepting our invitation. For myself, it's a personal pleasure to have been able to meet you after all this time of exchanges, which have led me to think a lot. I would like to thank the whole team of our class for the huge work you've done to organize this conference. I would like to thank very particularly Fernanda, Tomás, and Damián, the interpreters, because without them, this conference would not be possible. And they've done huge work and very good work. I would like to thank also all the students from the seminar because they have contributed a lot with their questions, with their doubts and being present. And of course, I would like to thank all of our colleagues from different parts of the world who have joined the conference. For us, it's been a huge effort, but it's been an enormous pleasure to organize this, to be harnessed free of charge by students, militants, activists, researchers, and everybody who is interested in discussing the theory of social reproduction with Susan Ferguson. A great pleasure. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.